About 9 months ago, I started a journey which was just going to be a nice revisit of a series I watched years ago. And while I remember enjoying it, I'd forgotten nearly everything about it. So seeing the first chapter for the visual novel available for free on Steam, I thought to give it a try and see if my once burning passion for this classic horror anime could be relit. Only to realize that the base of that passion was made of dry wood, doused with gasoline. I will be going over a brief overview of each chapter and my thoughts of them. I will keep from spoilers as much as possible, but when it does arise, there will be a warning on screen and a time for you to skip to. Higurashi no Naku Koro ni, or When the Higurashi Cry, follows the life of Keiichi Maibara, a city boy who has moved into a village in the rural side of Japan called Hinamizawa. Quickly fitting in with his peers, joins a friend group with Rika Furude, Satoko Hojo, Mion Sonozaki, and Rena Ryugu, living everyday life to their fullest, filled with childish innocence and joy. Then comes a village tradition, the Cotton Drifting Festival, or Watanagashi, a religious annual custom where the villagers can cleanse and enjoy themselves. This day serves Keiichi and his friends a fun time, but later that night, catches hold of information he had hoped was kept far away from him. For this information of the village's folklore and underground secrets would corrupt his image of this idyllic village. For the past 4 years on this day, one would be found dead and another missing. In the year of 1983, the curse of Oyashiro-sama strikes for the 5th year. And after that night, Keiichi's everyday life would come to an end. Upon booting up the game, had immediately noticed its age. At first repulsed by the abhorrent steam and original art style, I proceeded to do some digging and found the 07th mod, turning it into a whole new experience. With its updated visuals, voice acting, and soundtrack changes, made it bear a much more clean and welcoming appearance. Reliving the introduction to this isolated village led me to feel a bit nostalgic. This environment, while feeling so distant, had a sense of familiarity. The serene atmosphere conveyed through the group's interactions and soft strums of acoustic made me completely forget about the inevitable future tragedy. Although I felt this phase went on for a bit too long, I still thoroughly enjoyed it. Then, on the night of Watanagashi, I began to feel trepidatious. I knew the hours-long fun and games played by the club members was going to slowly deteriorate. The once sturdy, calming atmosphere collapsed, and within the rubble lied the fear of the unknown. Who is trustworthy? Why is this all happening? What is the cause? Just like Keiichi, I was bombarded with questions. I felt his panic, his hardship, his fear, and I realized that within the hours-long build-up, I had subconsciously attached myself to the group more than I had expected. I cared, but was unsure of how to think of these people who seemed so innocent only a few days prior. Despite knowing most of the outcome, I still had unease of what would come next, with that fear only to culminate in an ending that had me constantly on the edge of my seat. And after what seemed like a complete horror story, I then realized that I still have 7 chapters to go, leaving me with only questions and anticipation to find out more. I wasn't really a fan of the second chapter, Watanagashi Hen. I guess this was all coming off from the thrill of the first chapter, Onikakushi, and having the story reset and settle down with the peaceful times of the club wasn't what I was looking for initially. It was nice for the first hour or two, getting to see Hinamizawa peaceful once again. It made me want to cherish these moments, though that laugh of Rena's would still haunt me due to the negative connotation. But I felt the length of this act was drawn out to boredom. I saw it as no more than a drag to get through all of it. I understand the need to build up the differences between the chapters, but this first half could have been shortened significantly. Then, once again, was the start of the Watanagashi festival. My motivation to push forward came in full throttle. The atmospheric horror had enveloped the peaceful town once again, serving to broach the ominous mystery surrounding the village. This time, instead of being kept in the dark entirely, the first piece had been set in place, as Keiichi learned about the underground side of Hinamizawa, adding an entire new element to this enigma. Horror and suspense continuously rose throughout this latter half, ultimately leaving off the same feeling I had with Onikakushi, Then the ending came, and was once again left completely baffled and filled with questions. This may have been my least favorite chapter of the 8, but still had some thrilling moments within its latter half. To make sure I enjoy each chapter to the fullest, I took a break and began to read something else before continuing on. Once I had finished up Steins Gate 0, I resumed my journey through Chapter 3, Tatari-goroshi. With the club's antics being a lot more enjoyable this time around thanks to my break from it, I quickly became re-immersed into the story. This time, the story focused more on Satoko Hojo, divulging more of her past and how those circumstances come back to haunt her. One of the most interesting aspects of this chapter is how it puts you in the mind of a killer, someone who desperately wants to make things right, but without the time and knowledge of how to do it correctly, resorts to the only way to get out of the predicament. While their heart was in the right place, the implications it had, even though it may have seemed like it was the only choice, shows that it was still the incorrect road to go down. The entire second half of this chapter kept me glued to the screen, to the point where my perception of time had been completely distorted as hours felt like mere minutes. The thrill ride that was Tatari-goroshi had me hooked and pulled me to the finish line before I knew it. The way it executed its concept while still delivering vital information to the mystery was fantastic. Hearing about these supernatural events surrounding Keiichi tipped me into thinking the cause was just that. People who were dead, alive, a mysterious doppelganger, and events happened due to a single thought. Everything was simply nonsensical. Has Keiichi gone crazy, or is it the world around him? How credible are Keiichi's memories or his friends' testimonies? This bizarre turn of events had me bewildered with every piece of information. Like Keiichi, I felt lost. The results contradicted the path to get there. Being thrusted into this ludicrous anomaly, while confused, enhanced the mystery and bizarre atmosphere. In retrospect, how everything all perfectly fit in place is astounding. It all seems impossible to have a solid answer, but seeing how they all tie together now makes me appreciate this chapter much more. Then, even after the curtain closed, left the story off on an even bigger revelation that made me rethink the entirety of the situation. Sinister and baffling is the only way I can describe it. This part of the story completely deconstructed how I perceived this mystery. I knew that from the beginning it wanted to guide my direction in that of the supernatural. Then the Sonozaki piece came into play, and while I thought they were somewhat involved, it didn't explain a majority of the events that occurred within Onikakushi. But my mind became convinced when the scale tipped into the supernatural. In the end, all I'm left with is these pieces, all of which have opaque edges, making it difficult to truly see which ones connect. And this chapter was the first ember before the wildfire. With my unreliable memory of what follows, I thought I should continue this chapter-to-chapter intermission. Then, after a month or so, I once again found myself back in the village of Hinamizawa, but this time in the perspective of Akasaka Mamoru, in Chapter 4, Himatsubushi. Taking place 5 years before the events of the first 3 chapters, in an undercover case, Akasaka investigates the town of Hinamizawa, looking for clues on the whereabouts of a kidnapped child of an important political figure. Considering the name is the time-wasting chapter, I first thought this to be just that. A small break and filler between the question and answer arcs. But as it turns out, it gives more context before the curse and the unity of the villagers, taking a look at the dam project that once threatened the village. Despite taking place in a time of tension, through the events it covers, it is all very soothing. Within these trying times, there are always those fleeting moments of serenity, shown all through the lens of a protagonist you can't help but sympathize with through and through. I became invested in Akasaka's character and really began to feel for him throughout the course of this chapter. Then, 5 years after his mission was complete, he reunited with an officer he met during his investigation, Kurao Oishi, and what follows is a scene that set my passion ablaze. After learning about the disaster that struck the village and the premonitions given to him, helplessness and regret overwhelmed him, leading him to simply break down. This had invigorated not only Oishi and Akasaka to unravel the Hinamizawa mystery. I myself had become completely invested, and wanted to shine light upon the dark secrets. I came in expecting simple filler, but came out with more pieces to the puzzle, an empathetic character, and layers of foreshadowing and extra pieces hiding in plain sight. So I ventured onto the 5th chapter, Meakashi. It follows similar events to the 2nd chapter, expanding upon them with some minor differences. One being the switch of perspective from Keiichi to an outcast of the Sonozaki family, Shion. Starting 1 year prior to the ordinary events, shifts its focus onto the 4th year of the curse, one that has been heavily talked about in past chapters. It has the cover of a tragic love story, seeing this character's first experience of love then morph into a spiral of insanity. The inner monologue of Shion descends deeper within the spiral, filled with jealousy and pure rage to the family that turned her away. Gradually being ever more narrow-minded, with her pure instincts eventually being her guide. I was put in a difficult spot throughout, all thanks to Shion. I could empathize, but even though I wanted to, I couldn't sympathize with her. The actions she took, while drastic, stem from psychological damage that had been growing from her childhood, while trying to uncover the case behind the disappearance of her crush, forced the pieces she was given to fit. Her delusions drifted me along, feeling the exact same despair she had felt by the end of it, leaving my jaw dropped as a single statement destroyed any perceived implications given by this chapter. Yet despite that red herring, I wasn't disappointed. Somehow, that misconception didn't make this chapter feel pointless at all, while dumbstruck, could only feel pity for the person who had become a devil with nothing in return. The soundtrack was one thing that really made this arc strike deep with me. This is all thanks to its themes, Thank and You. The chords of thanks struck just right to lure me in and warm my heart. Only when You to play left me forlorn. Hearing the motif that once held connotations of joy to later shift into a slow, striking piece. You could say the song itself had become depressed. I'd felt like this motif had been constantly following me throughout this chapter. As weird as it is to say, it affected me so much that at times I just wanted to get away from it. But just when the story becomes tragic, it's there. Okay, I'm done. Looks like I can just read the tips and... wait. And just when I thought I made my way out of this spiral, while it is difficult to solidify my favorite chapter, this is debatably one of them. Chapter 6, Tsumihoroboshi, brings the story back to 1983, with the perspectives of Keiichi and Rena. With the latter taking the spotlight, her backstory was one that I really felt for. I was able to empathize and sympathize on a deep level. Dealing with emotional trauma, her development throughout this arc made her one of my favorite characters within Higurashi. The path she walks on is one of hardship, trudging through her subconscious baggage, but with help, takes a step onto a bare path to alleviate her pain. This was the first chapter that was keen on connecting the pieces of the puzzle, doing so in a manner not so obvious. It was difficult to tell if the story was trying to psych me out or shine light upon the dark truths. The way this information was conveyed made me constantly double take on what could be reality or fiction. Tsumihoroboshi has the most emotional weight tied to it. Keiichi, Rena, Mion, Satoko, and Rika display an unbreakable bond, helping up one another despite who they once were. Instead of joy turning into despair, I felt this to be more of despair turning into hope. That led to a bizarre yet satisfying conclusion. For the first time, the title card was a signal for a bright future, rather than the end of a tragedy. This chapter is a gem, infused with many elements to keep its vibrant luster. So as not to rant for too long, I'll keep it short and sweet. Rena's character arc, the outcome of events, and themes it handled puts this chapter near the top for me. Chapter 7, Minagoroshi. Whew, what an absolute journey this arc was. Confirming a piece at play that was alluded to numerous times before, it incorporates events from nearly every single chapter before it, using these pieces to find the solution to this puzzle. Along with Rika, I desperately wanted this cycle to end. For her and her friends to once again grasp the peace they had before the start of Watanagashi. The role she played was something I found to be genius, as she herself is almost like the reader, an observer to each tragedy that befalls the village. This made her easy to attach to and root for her to finally take action. This all brought a ray of hope, as each event that leads to misfortune is blocked off by the lack of inaction. After continuously submitting herself to fate, she was finally able to get a hold and advance forward. The plot did get repetitive somewhere in the middle, but its finale more than makes up for it. The final quarter of this chapter had me on edge the entire time. While peeking its head at the end of Tsumihoroboshi, the theming of hope begins to finally outshine the alleged eternal darkness. But it was foolish to believe that the light would be the end of anguish. Just when things looked bright, it ended only in more suffering. But through this suffering, the most vital piece was gained to form a coherent picture. This probably has one of the most intense and heart-wrenching finales. Just thinking about it brings tears to my eyes. Let's accept this sorrow, so we can embrace the joy as well. Believe in the future that's waiting for us. The miracle will happen. With Chapter 8, Matsuribayashi, all that's left was to fill in the blanks. It started off by giving the backstory to a character I was certain couldn't be redeemed, but somewhere along the lines I actually began to feel for their endeavors. They suffered from fate, and at the same time were brought up in the same way, only to inevitably fall once again, as if her life was just a prank by God. This cycle of luck brings them to desperation and is forced to finding a way to give their life meaning. They carried such personal and earnest ideals that I couldn't help but respect them for it. Despite knowing they probably won't reach it, I wanted them to find solace in something. This level of development is given to just about every commonly occurring character. This is done through a fun and unique way, as this section fills in nearly every missing piece the story had before then. The presentation was something I was immersed in. It had felt like I myself was putting together all the clues to fully figure out the events that had happened over these past 5 years. This part of the chapter really made me appreciate two characters in particular, Kyosuke Irie and Kurado Oishi. I liked and enjoyed both their personalities, but I'd been a bit curious as I'd felt Irie's past hasn't been mentioned much, and felt Oishi's motivation before this chapter didn't match the intensity of his feelings for this case. For Irie, what he had to go through and his reasoning for his career choice was something that spoke to me. How should we look at criminals? Are they simply bad people who need to be punished? Or should we look at them as broken and in need of a fix? His goals were something I completely supported and ended up rooting for more than I already had. As with Oishi, his outward cheerful personality had caused him to be my favorite from the beginning. He can be seen to jest quite often, and in certain scenarios doing so makes him seem a bit shady. This all stems from his determination to uncover the curse of Oyashiro-sama. Though his sheer will can lead him into desperation, and in turn can cause him to become short-sighted, acting rough and overstepping his boundaries. I was intrigued where his perseverance came from, and this short story of his answered it to a satisfying degree. Then of course, with everything else together, the final act is put into action. I don't know how else to say it other than, I'm so glad with how it turned out. With the mystery solved, as long as it didn't pull any out-of-place twist, I was going to be satisfied. And it did just that. It was just a fun send-off that used all the development given to the characters and the information for the story to end it off on an impactful and uplifting note. It made everything simply fun and enjoyable, giving wake to one of my favorite scenes due to the sheer absurdity of it all. You and your makeshift group infiltrate a small hidden facility containing highly skilled guards. As your team manages to clear out the majority, your group splits up to complete the team's 2 objectives. Unbeknownst to the rest, there lies an enemy unseen, grabbing hold of your partner, taking them hostage. While unarmed, what can you do? Loathing your powerlessness. But you can't let their life end in vain. So, what do? What else but to take a gamble and rely on a bluff? Sure, that works. Where is this going? Did he just make a JoJo's reference while their lives are all in jeopardy? What a badass. Everything that happened within Matsuribayashi was near perfection in my eyes, and was the ending I was hoping for. Higurashi no Naku Koro ni has been an amazing ride for me. Ever since the end of Chapter 4, I've been addicted to it. I could take forever and dissect parts that I loved and thought stood out, so instead, here are just a few. I felt the mystery was done brilliantly. It always had a way to play around with certain information, feeding lies within truths. Then, as I went through the answer arcs, pieces connected left and right, and was able to grasp everything the story was trying to convey. Higurashi not only managed to tell one of my favorite stories, but how it weaved that tale is one of my favorite things about it. With each chapter being its own storyline, it manages to have you go through a roller coaster of emotions that any normal story would have, then have you proceed through that pattern of emotion another 7 times, with each chapter's climax all having such an astounding impact, no matter how slow or dull it may have gotten somewhere before it. And while all the plot threads within that specific chapter may not all be tied together, it still feels conclusive, while also bearing an alluring trail to have you follow along until you reach the true finale. The surface level meaning of the story isn't all I left with, as its morals have and probably will stick with me. Experiencing a piece of fiction that manages to change my perception or beliefs on a subject is something I find invaluable. A message I can take and learn from and apply them to my everyday life, and Higurashi is one that I've taken the most from. Changing my perception on how to view someone who crosses the line of morality. Should they be forgiven or condemned by discrimination and punishment for as long as they live? Does the means really not justify the end? Questions like this really made me think deep on this subject. And in reality, these questions may not have a definite answer. It focused on subjects that I not only find interesting, but ones that I can relate to and appreciate with how they were brought up. There's a huge focus on mental illness, a field that I'm interested in that means a lot to me. It went in depth to detail just how disastrous accumulating stress and bottling up worries can be to one's mental state, but also took a look at how one can overcome or alleviate the mental obstacles in their path. Even though I said that the original art style was appalling at first, oddly enough, nearing the end of my experience around Chapter 7, I began to see Ryukishi's art style as somewhat appealing. It has this amateurish charm to it that in the end I couldn't really hate. I didn't realize how much I appreciated the soundtrack until I went back to listen to it. For most of the question arcs, I thought them to be lackluster, only to go back and realize they were perfect at setting the atmosphere. But once I reached the answer arcs, the soundtrack became a lot more memorable. It introduced one of my favorite motifs deriving from the track You. The execution and timing on these tracks made them carry heavy emotion. Just thinking back and listening to them floods in memories of the scenes they played over. It almost feels like the melody can single-handedly carry me through those scenes once again. While I am feeling the void from finishing up the main story, my journey isn't technically over. I still have the console arcs that I'm reading through and heard that the alternate end, Onikakushi, was particularly great. I also have Higurashi Ure, which contains the epilogue for the series. Then I have Ryukishi, the author's other works like Umineko and Sakonia. Then I have the sequel Higurashi anime Go and Sotsu, which I feel is unneeded but will give them a watch regardless once I've caught up on everything. Yeah, looking deeper into it, with all the manga, anime, different timelines, and a shared universe, it seems to be a core deep hole I'm willing to jump into. And if Umineko or Sakonia are just as good, looks like I'll be stuck in this hole and the Nasuverse for a long time. Side note, really could see his inspiration from Tsukihime. I really appreciated being confronted by a teacher who looked oddly familiar, and not to mention his references to Tsukihime were a delight. Those were my thoughts on my journey of Higurashi no Naku Koro ni. Please feel free to let me know your thoughts as well. And if this is your first time hearing about this series, I highly recommend you check it out. The first chapter is still available for free on Steam, and I'll leave the link to the 07th mod in the description below. I do plan to make a review and some extra topical videos on this, as this is one story that I adore. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. My next video will be related to Melty Blood. Thanks for watching. Later.